I went to college in Seattle. That's where Lisa and I met, 1979. And in college, my life began to open and I became aware of topics like spirituality for the first time. I never had any exposure to religious activity growing up in the countryside outside of Fairbanks, Alaska. And so it was quite a surprise to learn that there was a lot of mystery and unexplained stuff out there. And I embarked on what has become a lifelong odyssey of searching and seeking and imagining, and really became interested in spirituality and metaphysics. And I felt like I studied a lot, but really it was just a lot of books and a lot of stuff that made me ask more questions, and I really wasn't going anywhere too far. I wanted to meditate, I wanted to pray, I didn't know how to. And then one day in 1997, I met a woman named Mary from the Mayan tradition. And my life after that encounter changed. And I want to tell a little bit of that story because it gets us to where we are and why I would talk about altars and having practices that we can use to find calmness and peace and to attain our birthright of having harmony in this life. So I met Mary in Seattle. At the time I was involved with a group of artists, and we had 7 giant doors that were all painted to look like rock and had interesting symbology on them. They were outside of the Nordstrom in Seattle at Westlake Park, and we had a cinematographer, and there were people walking through the doors, and it was actually a dorgan because each door made a sound, and when you open the door, so you could actually play the doors. And anyway, Mary was napping apparently that afternoon, and for some reason got up and took a walk, and we bumped into each other in Seattle. And the day before, I had returned from my first trip ever to the Maya lands in a place called Palenque in the Mexican state of Chiapas, a place that I've probably been a dozen times, which has become very special to me. She was leaving the next day to go to Palenque. So we had this upwardly spiraling conversation. She politely bothered me for about a year to study with her, which I did not take her up on. But then eventually one day I went to Yakima where she was holding a retreat, and spent some time over there with her, and my life changed because I found myself for the first time in this lifetime walking consciously upon a spiritual path and committing myself to doing something that made sense and that had support, and which I had never experienced before in all the readings and the curious researches that I'd done on spirituality and metaphysics. Okay, so if we fast forward a bit, that's 1997, and then we get to the year 2008, and you might recall that there were a lot of interesting news articles and sensational internet posts about the end of the world, the end of the Mayan calendar. Do we remember at that time? I thought it was kind of crazy that there were so many voices out there with so many opinions about the matter, but that none of the people who were Mayan were getting any airtime. And we had a website at the time that we had hundreds of thousands of visitors, and we would get emails from people asking about the end of the calendar or the end of the world. And it got really serious a few times. We had a call, we'd get calls sometimes from a woman whose elementary school daughters had come home in tears because the world was going to end. I mean, make what you will of that, but the point is that this craziness about interpreting the times and the changing cycles of our times were affecting people to have a lot of worry and fear. So I thought, well, I'm going to write about what the Mayans who are alive today have to say themselves about the times we're living in, and about this great cycle of the calendar that's turning over, about humanity going from this era of the 4th sun, this 5,000 plus year long cycle, into the 5th sun, which would move from the 4th sun of male-dominated energy to a 5th sun where balance is eventually attained between the feminine and the masculine energies. Well, teacher Mary burst my bubble. She said, no, people don't need to hear more about Mayan prophecy. If you really want to write and do something, write about what people really need, how to live a fearless, harmonious life that is led by spirit. 2008. So I was going on a backpacking trip a few days later to hike the John Muir Trail in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. And I took a little journal with me, and I took a little tape recorder with me. And I found myself on the trail jotting or uttering things about practices that people have done for longer than we've counted time to be peaceful, to find the calm inside, to come into balance with themselves, to feel harmony. And so I wrote a whole bunch about prayer as a practice, about meditation, about making offerings, about being with nature, about fasting, about being artistic, leading a creative artistic life, about ceremony, about ancient wisdom. But the first chapter became the chapter about altars, because for me, maybe I'm someone who needs tools more than the average person. But to be able to ground all this stuff that I was experiencing and learning and churning into some symbolism that would help me center in the form of an altar became so obvious and so important to me personally. And so in my book, I have a chapter on each of these topics that I told you about. There are masters who know more about each of them than I do, who have beautiful books about them. I chose to simply take a bunch of these topics and write a bit about them to introduce them to people who, like me, had come to some sort of crossroads in their life where they didn't know where they were, or maybe they didn't know what to do. And even now, as I become overall more balanced and overall more harmonious, I still find myself off kilter at times where oh crap, I'm acting out of my integrity. I get snippy with somebody or this or that. And so while it's easy to put too much importance on a simple thing like an altar, I like to use it as a starting place when I'm talking about such topics, because so much of what we're dealing with in this world is mental, is cerebral, is conceptual, is thought driven. We sometimes are told that we are materialists and we live in a materialistic way more than we live spiritually. And yes, there certainly is truth to that in various ways. I would suggest that perhaps our mental activity and our reeling ahead to future scenarios that could go terribly wrong, or our folding back into past histories to imagine what could have been if we'd only done something different, are overriding aspects of our mental life that need balancing. And so for me, the altar again becomes a physical artifact that brings us right here, right now. It seems so simple in some ways. Let's ask what an altar is. We go to a dictionary, it's going to say something like a physical artifact used for the placement of sacrifices or offerings for ritual purposes. Altars are found in all of the structures, for the most part, of our ancestors from many different traditions. They are usually the central, most important part of those temples and shrines and places that our ancestors from these many traditions have created. Here we are in 2021, very far removed in a lot of ways from antiquity, when many of these places that still inspire us were built, like the Great Pyramids, for example, one example. And for me, the altar is made more powerful now by each of us having the opportunity to personalize whatever it is that we need to symbolize that harmony, that balance, that calmness, that peace. And so it's easy to overthink these topics because it has to be so perfect and so special, and I'm not sure if I should do this or I should do that. We can start very simply, and we can expand the definition of what an altar is. Now, we just made this group altar, this beautiful, simple construct earlier today, and it's a lovely way for us to acknowledge our togetherness and to acknowledge that there's more to this existence than just our physicality, and we can each interpret that in whichever way we choose to do so. As far as making a personal altar, it's really productive to expand the concept of what that is. Because really, when we go back, I'll touchstone on the Mayan tradition just because it's a tradition that I've had more experience with. There's a concept that uses a word called chuleo, C-H-U-L-E-L, and it's called soul essence. The idea is that objects that we form relationships with become imbued with soul essence. So for example, it could be a rattle, it could be a crystal, it could be a bell, it could be a necklace, it could be whatever it is that one creates a relationship with, and it becomes an object of power that is there to assist us as part of that centering, that harmonizing, that balancing, that making us feel good, that, oh, glad you're here. I could call this little pocket stone, this little piece of lapis here in my pocket, I could interpret that as an altar. It's something special for me. It's not for anybody else, but it helps me in my interactions with the world. Or what about this? Something that was a gift to me many years ago. It has a deer hoof on it. A deer is an important archetype and ally for me personally. And to have deer with me in this way every day. So I'm talking about expanding what the idea of an altar is. Having said that, whether it's in one's home, in their abode, or perhaps if they have an office in a workplace or a desk or a garden, it's having a place where we're able to do some arrangement of these objects that matter to us in a pleasing, harmonious way that causes us to go, oh. Thank you for reminding me. Altars are reminders. They're organizing forces that cause us to be able to remember that innate harmony that we have within us. That is our birthright. So altars can play amazingly important roles in just helping us remember. Conversely, they can also function as an antenna. We've announced our intention to the universe that we want to be more calm, we want to be more harmonious, or maybe it's more, maybe I want to be more actively dedicated to a spiritual path, or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be spiritual. But we're able to use these objects that are imbued with soul essence to magnify our intentions and remind us of what is important to us personally, and they help us resonate at a higher frequency. It's about our vibrations, what raises us up, what gives us joy. And there are many things in life that can do that, from our relationships to our creative activities. There's an infinite list that could be made if we interview all of us together to see what those activities or those items are. But having an altar is a practical way to jumpstart and raise that ground level of what we're experiencing to a higher place. So I like to talk about it in that way. What are simple ways that we can do an altar? It's easy to overthink things. Oh, I've got to get 50 items together and I'm going to arrange them just like this. But what if we just have a small table or a small shelf that has a simple little cloth that we got from our grandmother or from some trip across the world that means something to us, and we have a candle on it or a crystal or just some simple tiny little thing that reminds us, that gives us joy, that emanates harmony, right? So it's really very simple in that regard. So it's amazing to walk into a place like this shop, Mystical Wares, right? It's like, wow. It's like looking at all these creatures out there, and who's talking back at you, who's connecting with you. We do have predilections for certain things too, so it's curious to see. I was reading through journals recently, and I came across something that I wrote that I don't remember writing, and kind of struck me as odd, but then I realized how much I liked it, and it's My altar reminds me how to behave on planet Earth. My altar reminds me how to behave on planet Earth. Portable altars are pretty neat too. I have historically done a fair amount of travel, a lot for my work, and also some trips to visit certain sacred sites and places. And I would take a portable altar with me. And one iteration of those was a little cigar box that I had painted up, and I had a little votive in there, and I had a few other items, crystals and stuff in little bags so they didn't clunk around and break each other. And I would set it up, when I got to my hotel room for the night or whatever. What's interesting that happens in the Andean tradition, you'll find it in Peru, for example, is the idea of mesas, which are these prayer bundles. They're made with cloths like this. This is a typical kind of cloth that might be used for that. And the stones and other objects that are used to fill the mesas are like I was speaking of earlier, they're imbued with some sort of soul essence, and they're there to help do work for us out here so we don't have to do the work in here. It's easier on us physically to be able to masticate and work on the stuff we're dealing with out here with objects sometimes than it is to have to let the body do all the work. So these mesas, there's a great description of them by Alberto Villoldo. He's an author and he's a shaman, and he described a mesa as a collection of power objects used to engage the forces of nature. A collection of power objects used to engage the forces of nature. That's very beautiful and useful somehow to me. So I didn't really want to make this a long talk. I mean, I could talk more, but I really appreciate you being here, and I know time is precious and that we're dealing with a lot of stress and intensity in these transformational times. It means a lot to me personally to be with people in any form during this period of time where it's hard to be gracefully social, and I really honor that we're together, and I appreciate it, and I'd love to have a chance to meet you all and talk with you a little bit if you're not too much of a hurry. And I really thank you so much for being here, and I'd love to if you have any comments that you want to make, I'd be happy to hear them, or if there are any questions that I can answer, I'd be happy to do that as well. And may the blessings be. May the blessings be. Thank you so much.